Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Louis XIV is the longest reigning monarch in recorded history, ruling over France with absolute power for over 72 years. Under his rule, France would be transformed from a financially struggling kingdom to the leading power in Europe, creating an empire with King Louis at its center. First, we'll talk about Louis's life, and then bring you face to face with the Sun King. So let's go ahead and get started. Louis Dauphin was born on September 5, 1638, in the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, to his father, Louis XIII, and his mother, Anna of Austria. For 23 long years, Anna and Louis had been trying to bear an heir for France. Anna had been pregnant 4 times, but tragically all of them were stillbirths, until Louis. Seen as a miracle to his parents, they would name their son Louis le Dieu donné, meaning Louis the God-given. Because of her hardships, Louis's relationship with his mother was uncommonly affectionate. Queen Anna would spend all of her time with her son, and over the years, Louis began to love the things his mother loved: the arts, food, and himself. It was Queen Anna that gave Louis the belief in himself, a confidence that would become legendary as he grew older. In the winter of 1642, King Louis XIII had fallen ill, and by the spring of 1643, he knew that his death was imminent. But before he was gone, he wanted to be sure that his son's rule would be secure. In his will, the king decreed that a regency council would rule on his son's behalf, with his mother Anna at the head. Although she was a Spaniard by birth, Louis knew that Anna would never betray him or their dear son. But he was only partly right. Only days after King Louis's death, Anna would annul his will. She exiled her husband's ministers and appointed her own, making herself the sole regent of France. With France and her native Spain at war, many feared that Queen Anna would defer to her brother Felipe IV in Spain. But her loyalty to her own son led Anna to keep her promises to France. She knew that in order for her son to be king, she would have to fall in line, at least publicly. She would entrust the government to Cardinal Mazarin, who would become the public-facing ruler of France. But behind the scenes, she would be working to heavily influence his decisions. Anna had a plan, one that would take decades to unfold. On the 14th of May, 1643, at just 4 years old, Louis was crowned King Louis XIV, becoming the master of all of France. But until he came of age, his mother and Cardinal Mazarin would be the ones effectively ruling over France. In 1648, Anna and Cardinal Mazarin were able to negotiate lasting peace in Europe, ending the 30 Years' War, and Anna was able to focus all of her influence on what her son's reign would look like. She believed that Louis was a gift from God, not only to her, but to all of France. So she began to expand royal powers at the expense of French nobility and parliaments, and she raised taxes on them substantially. When they attempted to resist, Anna would have them arrested. When Anna arrested the leader of the Parliament of Paris, the people of Paris erupted into riots. And then, on the night of February 9th, 1651, a mob of angry Parisians broke into the royal palace, demanding to see their king. They made their way into the royal bedchamber and found the child King Louis asleep. For some reason or another, this sight subdued the crowd, and they left the royal palace quietly. But King Louis wasn't asleep. He had heard the mob come all the way to his room. Louis would never forget that night, the night his childhood ended. A civil war called the Fronde would begin and last for years, driving the royal family away from Paris. Louis would suffer during these years: poverty, fear, humiliation, and the house arrest of his mother by the nobility shaped King Louis into the man he would become. He would never forgive the nobles or the common people for what they had done. As Louis grew into manhood, the civil war that had started against his mother and Cardinal Mazarin lost steam. And although he was now 18, he never imposed on the cardinal's power, instead learning from the cardinal about how to rule with elegance and display. During his time learning under Cardinal Mazarin, the young king had fallen in love with a woman named Marie Mancini, who was the niece of Cardinal Mazarin. When the thought of the two marrying was brought up, neither King Louis or Cardinal Mazarin were mad at the idea. But his mother Anna was absolutely against it. Anna had fought and suffered for years, fighting a bitter war against her father and brother, all for her son. The only thing she asked of Louis in return was for him to marry her brother's daughter, Marie Theresa, unifying the two nations in peace. Love or duty? This question would haunt Louis for the next 2 years, and he begged his mother to change her mind, but she would not. In the end, Louis chose duty, and Marie Mancini was sent away. In 1660, Louis XIV and Marie Theresa of Spain were married. Less than a year later, in 1661, Louis's mentor and father figure, Cardinal Mazarin, would die. Mazarin had ruled as France's leader for nearly 2 decades, and now that he was gone, everyone was talking about who would replace him. Whoever Louis decided to choose to become Mazarin's successor would become the most powerful man in France. And Louis's choice would shock them all. Up to this moment, I have been pleased to entrust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself. I request and order you to seal no orders except by my command. I order you not to sign anything, not even a passport, without my command, to render account to me personally each day, and to favor no one. Louis would take no ministers. He would take no advice. He would rule his kingdom however he pleased. And just like that, at 23 years old, Louis's absolute power in France had finally begun. But many were obviously against Louis having unchecked power. Nicolas Fouquet was the superintendent of finances in France, an ambitious, influential, and wealthy man who was eager to assume any power Mazarin had left in his wake. To impress his fellow nobility, he would throw lavish parties in his castle, the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte. The sheer scale and opulence was awe-inspiring, leaving some, including King Louis, to wonder how Fouquet had gotten so wealthy. Not long after, Fouquet was charged with embezzlement of government funds and sentenced to life imprisonment. Louis would abolish his post and reorganize it himself. He would raise taxes and cut out middlemen. But the impression that the chateau had left on King Louis would inspire him to begin construction of his own palace. He would choose his father's hunting lodge, built on a hill as the location, and name it after the village nearby, Versailles. Within 5 years of Louis XIV's takeover, France had halved its debts and increased its revenue tremendously. It started to become clear that Louis wasn't just this power-hungry dictator, butchering away at the government without any thought. He was ambitious, yes, but it was because he wanted France to thrive under his rule. In fact, some of his contributions would change the way the modern world works. In Louis's Great Ordinances, also called Code Louis, he would attempt to regulate law throughout all of France. At the time of Louis's reign, the south of France still followed Roman civil law. And although Louis wasn't entirely successful, the Code Louis played an important role in history as the basis of the Napoleonic Code, from which many modern legal codes are derived. Louis's attention would also turn to his military. He would again take power from the nobility, who had a monopoly over senior military positions and ranks, and modernize his army, reorganizing it into a professional, well-trained force with talented generals. In 1665, Louis's wife Marie Therese's father, King Felipe IV of Spain, died. When Louis had agreed to marry Marie Theresa, she had agreed to renounce all claims to Spanish territory, for herself and all of her descendants upon the payment of a dowry of 500,000 in Spanish gold. But that payment had never come, so in turn, her renouncement of the land in Spanish Netherlands was nullified, giving Louis his first chance to use his new and improved military. Seeing all the changes the new French king was implementing, the surrounding countries began to grow nervous, and they began to have secret talks, finding a common enemy in France. England, the Netherlands, and Sweden would unite together, calling themselves the Triple Alliance. Facing all three was out of the question, but Louis had no problem facing one, and he knew that everyone had a price. He paid Sweden to remain neutral, and was able to convince King Charles II of England that an alliance between France and England would be incredibly powerful and profitable. The Dutch were left alone to deal with France, exactly as Louis had intended. When France invaded in 1672, the French army's strength nearly overran the entire Dutch Republic and caused hysteria to spread throughout, leading to a coup that brought William of Orange to power. Seeing just how powerful the French military had become was terrifying to the rest of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had overlooked France for years, but now with his immense influence, he was able to form an anti-French alliance with Spain and the Dutch. England would soon join in as well. With nearly all of the major powers in Europe banded against him, one would think that King Louis would signal the retreat. But instead, he went on the offensive, taking towns in the Spanish Netherlands and gaining territory with the invasion of French Comte. Louis had complete command of his army, better generals, and better logistics than any other army he faced. In 1678, the war would come to an end, with a treaty that allowed Louis to keep most of the land he had gained. Louis had held off a huge European alliance against him, and had proven the dominance of the French military. The French people began to see him for how great he knew he was. In 1682, a French expedition reached the end of the Mississippi River and named the Mississippi Basin La Louisiane in honor of King Louis. French colonies were now multiplying in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. At the age of 39, Louis had turned his kingdom into an empire. By the 1680s, Louis was at the height of his power, and France was thriving under his leadership. They had the strongest military, the highest population, and were the wealthiest country in Europe. But Louis also allowed the arts to flourish. He held music competitions to find the greatest musicians in France, created the Royal Academy of Opera and the Royal Academy of Dance, performing in over 40 major ballets himself. In 1682, Louis would finish one of his greatest achievements, finally moving away from Paris to his Palace of Versailles, one of the most extravagantly beautiful buildings ever made. The building was the ultimate flex of power, wealth, and sophistication, undeniably remarkable to nobility visiting the King of France from any number of countries. But it wasn't just nobility from other countries that Louis was trying to impress. He had created the immense and beautiful palace to entice nobles from his own country to come and live with him under his thumb. This way, Louis could control everything about their lives. He would entertain them with extravagant luxury and feasts, making them feel like they lived in the grandest palace in the world. But he also created elaborate court rituals where he was always the center of attention. The nobles would watch him get dressed, eat his meals, and King Louis would remember which of the nobles attended these rituals, granting them favors and positions in exchange, breeding a culture that all nobility needed to tend to the king if they wanted to rise in power. Louis would secretly read every letter that came through Versailles so that he could know intimate things, secrets about his nobility, and what their private thoughts about him were. He had never forgotten the nobility that rose against his mother. This was his way of exacting revenge. With the nobility under his control, Louis finally had what he always wanted: truly unlimited power. In 1683, Louis's wife Marie Theresa of Spain died. They had had 6 children together, but only the first, also named Louis, had survived to adulthood. Although his marriage was affectionate at first, King Louis had never remained faithful and had entertained countless mistresses, having at least 13 illegitimate children with them. In fact, his favorite son, Louis Auguste, was born from one of his mistresses. He loved Louis Auguste so much that he legitimized him and showered him with gifts, giving him the best tutors and best education. He was also very attentive of Louis Auguste's caretakers, noting one specifically that was especially loving to his son. Françoise d'Aubigné caught Louis's eye, and soon Louis realized that she was unlike anyone he had ever met. Headstrong, she would talk to Louis as an equal, something that no one else dared to do. The two would secretly marry at Versailles in late 1683. Françoise was a deeply devout Catholic, and although Louis himself had been religious before her, it would become a very important part of his life from here on out. But in 1685, Louis would issue the Edict of Fontainebleau, stating that he would no longer tolerate the existence of Protestants in France. All churches would be demolished, and all Protestants would be forcibly baptized. This news horrified Protestants living throughout Europe, and Louis's public image suffered a damaging blow. This one act would begin a domino effect that would end with war in Europe. In 1688, the Catholic English king, James II, was deposed in the Glorious Revolution by his own daughter, Mary II, and William of Orange. William of Orange was a Dutch prince who had come into power because of Louis's devastating invasion of the Netherlands in the early 1670s. For most of William's life, Louis had been the villain. Now, William was King of England, and more importantly, he was a champion of the Protestant faith. Louis's behavior since the Edict of Fontainebleau made William realize that he was a danger to all who disagreed with him, and he would take that message to the powers of Europe, asking them to form an alliance against Louis to preserve the peace and liberties of Europe. England, the Dutch Republic, Spain, and the Habsburg Empire would all join, calling themselves the Grand Alliance. But the new alliance would have little time to celebrate. King Louis had been fighting against European alliances his whole life, and every single one of them had failed. This one would be no different. Before the ink on their alliance treaties had even dried, Louis was preparing for war. He sent his army to the Rhineland and ordered them to burn everything down, leaving nothing for an invading force to survive off of. The Grand Alliance was no match for Louis. France's land forces were largely dominant against the Allies, and as the war dragged on, its human and financial cost began to cause problems between the Grand Alliance members. The war would grind to a halt, with nothing being gained by either side for years. By 1696, even Louis, with his eternal confidence, was happy to accept a treaty of peace. He was able to keep some of his territorial gains, but returned Catalonia back to Spain. It was a subtle reminder to everyone that the peace wouldn't last long. There was still one thing they needed to resolve. Which of them would sit on the Spanish throne? The Spanish King Carlos II had been ill for most of his life, but by 1696 his health was rapidly deteriorating. Carlos is mostly remembered by history as the image of the Habsburg Empire's excessive inbreeding. He was most likely sterile and had no children to rule after he was gone. Now, the next part is really important, but also pretty hard to explain, so bear with me. Before Carlos was born, the heir presumptive to the vast Spanish Empire had been his older sister, Marie Theresa. Marie Theresa would then end up marrying Louis and having one son, the Grand Dauphin. With Carlos II childless, the next heir to the Spanish throne would fall down Marie Theresa's line, to King Louis's grandson, Philip. To Europe's horror, Louis XIV, the man that all of them had been unsuccessfully trying to stop, was about to have a grandchild on the throne of the Spanish Empire. The only other claimant, represented on this right side, was the second son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. His name was Archduke Charles. Now, to everyone else in Europe, Archduke Charles was the much better choice. No one wanted a French king ruling the vast Spanish Empire, but it was not up to them. In 1700, King Carlos died, and in his will, he gave the throne of the Spanish Empire to Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou. This was incredible news for Louis and his line. This exact moment was the reason why Louis's mother made him choose duty over love all those years ago and marry Marie Theresa in the first place. But for the rest of Europe, the implications of a French king on the Spanish throne were unacceptable. What would happen when Louis died? Could he leave his kingdom to Philip? Would France and Spain unite? All of these burning questions required an answer from Louis. When Spanish ambassadors formally offered the throne to Philip, Louis considered refusing it, but only for a moment. King Louis accepted the Spanish throne on behalf of his grandson, who became King Philip V of Spain on November 16, 1700. Realizing that war was now inevitable, King Louis would add fuel to the fire. He would go on to state that Philip would retain all of his French rights to the throne, meaning Philip could potentially inherit the French throne as well. And with that, the kings of Europe had heard enough. The War of the Spanish Succession began the following year on July 19, 1701. It would bring absolute devastation to France. Although the beginning of the war went well for France, the combined efforts of the entire alliance began to take its first toll on French troops, and the myth of the French army being invincible was finally broken. After this, the defeat of French troops came time and time again. Problems began to stack on top of each other. France's debt was mounting, famine was beginning to spread all throughout France, and there was no end to the misery in sight. Despite appearing as an unwavering force, the death and destruction of his people was the thing that finally drove Louis to despair. By the winter of 1708, Louis was willing to accept peace at nearly any cost. He agreed to hand over the Spanish Empire to Archduke Charles, and even consented to giving up all the territorial gains he had made during his lifetime. But he couldn't guarantee that Philip V would accept the terms that he agreed to. The Grand Alliance, looking down on Louis for the first time after decades of war, wanted more. They demanded that Louis invade Spain himself, attacking his grandson and forcing him to denounce his empire. Louis would never accept these terms, and the fact that they had refused him at his weakest rekindled a fire in his heart. The French military began to truly fight back for the first time in years. At the Battle of Malplaquet, over 25,000 Allied men would die, compared to only 10,000 French. Although the Allies would claim victory, the insanely high price of life began to cause divisions within the Grand Alliance. The turning point of the war came when Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I died at only 32 years old, with no children, leaving none other than Archduke Charles to become the Holy Roman Emperor himself. The rest of Europe suddenly realized that the Holy Roman Empire would be the sole benefactor of this war. In 1715, the War of the Succession finally ended, with Philip V renouncing his French inheritances and dividing small parts of his empire between Austria and England. Now well into his 70s, King Louis's final war had taken its harshest toll. Not long after it was over, Louis's health quickly deteriorated. On the 1st of September 1715, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, died in his beautiful palace of Versailles. One of the most capable men to ever grace a throne, King Louis's reign of 72 years changed everything for France. Under Louis, France became a global and cultural powerhouse, ushering in a new golden age of the arts and reason in Europe. And according to Napoleon, King Louis XIV was the only king of France worthy of the name. So, what did the illustrious Sun King really look like? Louis was not difficult to bring to life, given just how much he loved his own image. There were hundreds of portraits created during Louis's long life, basically from birth and all the way through the later years of his reign. And of course, these images are propaganda, right? They're meant to show the strength of Louis's absolute rule over France. But surprisingly, they do show his features quite consistently. We see the same arching brows, the same thin, hooked nose, and cleft chin in every depiction. Louis was a king famous for his sense of fashion, and most notably, his hair. In fact, his hair was kind of his thing. Louis actually began balding in his early 20s, and he was already wearing partial hair extensions in this portrait. He transitioned to full wigs later on in life, and even set the trend for them. He's actually the reason we see American founding fathers wearing wigs almost a century later. You can see the evolution in portraits as his lifestyle got even more grand and his power even more absolute. His early portraits look regal but simple and move into extravagance as he gets older. This famous work by Hyacinthe Rigaud is one of the most famous portraits of the Sun King, showing unnaturally young legs, a huge wig, and a completely lustrous environment. But again, it's interesting that Louis didn't seem as concerned with touching up his face or looking more handsome in these images. He's more concerned with the impression of power that he's giving. Louis originally commissioned this portrait as a gift for his grandson, but ended up loving it so much he kept it for himself, which I find hilarious. The reason we know this image is fairly accurate to how Louis really looked is that it matches this honestly unsettling waxwork made by Antoine Benoit. Benoit created a gallery of waxworks long before the time of Madame Tussaud, who made the famous death mask of Marie Antoinette that I worked from. Waxworks became really popular in France because of their accuracy, and people would travel from all over to see the true face of the king. This work even impressed Louis, who gave Benoit the title of premier sculpteur. Since his reign was so long, I'm going to be recreating Louis as both a young and older man. So let's take a look at the face of the Sun King now. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you for the next video.